Chile, the longest country on our planet, home of the world's most beautiful places, the only country in the world that has a sample of all the possible climate conditions exists on our planet, from deserts to icy mountains to tropical forests, home of incredible views, wines, gastronomy, and people. A true paradise on earth.
Estamos protestando por unas problemáticas sobre todo el sistema en general, sobre todo el sistema neoliberal que estamos hablando en Chile. Sufrió una crisis, llegamos a una crisis en la que nos dimos cuenta de que ya este sistema ya no puede dar más.
As you may have understood by now, I'm not here to convince you to buy a ticket to Chile, but rather talk about its history. A history that first inspired and then traumatized millions around the globe. I want to tell you about the road to a dream that ended in a reactionary nightmare. Chilean history is beloved both by the left and by the right, although for different periods of its history. Because Chile, in a very short period of time, went from being ruled by an open and self-proclaimed communist to a full-on neoliberal blood dictatorship. And when I say neoliberal, I mean the economical part. Because despite being a fascist regime, economically, Chile Pinochet regime was one of the most liberal countries that there ever existed. Because those things don't contradict each other. This apparent contradiction still have a lot of impact in today's Chile, a country that despite having one of the highest GDPs in South America is still one of the most unequal countries in the world. This is mainly a result of neoliberal economical policies introduced by Pinochet government in the 80s and 90s. And although, and despite the end of Pinochet regime, the veil of neoliberalism and its brutal policies still covered the entirety of South America, with its most recent and aggressive manifestation in Argentina. We will start this story from very far away, more precisely from 19th century Chile. Like many other South American countries, Chile gained its independence in the 19th century, more precisely in 1818, after they defeated the Spanish forces. At that time, Chile, like many other South American countries, was mainly an agricultural colony, although with its specificities. So how was this agricultural economy organized? Mainly through haciendas, and hacienda in the 19th century Chile was a sprawling agricultural state owned by a small wealthy elite. This elite consisted of individuals who had acquired vast land holdings through various means, including inheritance, land grants from the Spanish crown, and purchases. The owners of haciendas were typically part of the upper class, and many of them were descendants of Spanish colonists. Hacienda was also characterized by the central manor house, serving both as an administrative hub and the residence of the landlord family. From the structural part of view, this vast estate encompassed fields of wheat, maize, barley, and other crops, along with pastures for livestock, such as cattle and sheep. Haciendas had an intricate social hierarchy, with the level of force consisted indigenous people, mestizos, and lower-class laborers. They were all temporary workers, which made them highly dependent on the landlord, which in some way is a Chilean specificity. Because of its geography, Chile didn't receive any or almost any African slaves. And so, from its inception, this system was highly dependent on seasonal workers that I just mentioned, which will play a very important part in the Chilean history later on. In its first decades, This was the reality of existence in Chile, an extremely rural country dominated by a small elite who owned the majority of land and held the majority of political power. Things started to change only in the midst of the 19th century, when Europe and Europeans stopped fighting within themselves, when the majority of revolution were over and Europe was ready for a new chapter in its history. Of course, I'm talking about colonialism on an industrial scale. In Chilean history, one of the most important countries will be Prussia, a relatively new player in Europe at the time, but one of the most powerful countries in the mid-19th century Europe, a highly industrialized and militarized European superpower. Unlike other European superpowers at the time, Prussia also decided to colonize other countries. So, basically they created the Prussian Department of Colonization and started sending people all around the globe, where they could. But why Chile, you might ask? Mainly, Prussia was very recent inside the European concert arena, so because of that, they were forced to send their settlers to places not yet occupied by the French, English, and other European maestros. The first wave was in the 1840s. Just in that decade alone, Prussia has sent around 30,000 colonists into Chile, which was a lot by the time. Of course, by being white Europeans, the majority of these colonists occupied privileged positions in Chilean society. They entered the government, but most importantly, the army. So, if later on I mispronounce some German name while referring to a Chilean general, don't be surprised. Prussia's influence in the Chilean army is still felt to this day. Not only still a good amount of generals and officers have a German name, but also their military uniform. These pictures that you're seeing right now is a photo of the current day Chilean military uniform, which, as you may very rightly suspect, has a lot in common with Prussian military uniforms from the 19th century. So besides the aesthetic change, how did the Prussian influence the Chilean army? Chilean army got completely modernized in equipment and tactics, making Chile one of the most powerful militaries in the areas at the time, which of course resulted in almost immediate military action. Because if you have a good army, you better put it to use, or else you're just a peaceful wanker. First, Chile used this newly acquired military force to destroy any internal contradiction that there was inside the country, creating a central government that controlled every province, destroying any kinds of separatism. After consolidation within itself, Chile engaged in what is now known as the War of the Pacific, which very briefly was a military conflict between Chile on one side and Peru and Bolivia on the other side. And the reason why I'm mentioning it here is because this war was extremely important for the Chilean economy. By winning this war, Chile has gained control over massive territories that were extremely rich in nitrate deposits. In common language, we call it animal feces, which may surprise you, but at the time were the best form of fertilizer and also, but none less important, very important to make explosives, which perfectly coincide with the time that Europe began its arms race, which was a long period before the First World War that every country was arming itself to the teeth. As you may imagine, the War of the Pacific transformed Chilean economy, contributing to its modernization and setting the stage for the Chile to emerge as a prosperous nation in the 20th century. Also in this same war, they acquired a very rich copper mine, and this at the time were not very important, but giving you a small spoiler of what is to come, they will be very important. These newfound riches not only changed Chile economically, but also changed the country socially, because a massive industrialization and a mining process were started. And, as we all know, with a rapid industrialization, there comes a rapid rise in left-wing ideas, followed by a revolutionary and progressive spirit that shakes the pillar of society. Unfortunately, the awakening of the proletariat as a class in itself is normally accompanied or even preceded by the awakening of the bourgeoisie, as in class as well, and their class-centered ideology, which in the 19th century was predominantly based on the idea of nationalism. This duality will be very visible in the 20th century. I'm gonna talk more in depth about the Chilean nationalism in my Pinochet video. Although, I want to stress that despite nationalism and race theory seeming ridiculous to us in the 21st century, in the 19th century nationalism was considered a very progressive ideology. And the Chilean one was no exception. Although, for me, from all the race theories that I ever heard, the Chilean one is definitely on my top 3 of the silliest one. It's a theory whose main creator is called Nicolas Palacios, and I'm gonna tell it to you as it was once told to me by a Chilean person. So why is the Chilean race superior? Following the doctrine of Palacios, we can conclude that the Chilean man is a mix between the German spirit and the indigenous pure essence. At the time, when I first heard this story, my first question was, wait, how does the German fit in? Which apparently is a very logical and easy according to a Chilean race theory. Because who conquered Chile? The Spanish. What Spanish? The conquistadors. Who were the conquistadors? The warrior caste. And who were the warrior caste in Spain originally? The Goths, the German tribe that moved there after the fall of the Roman Empire. So, when the descendants of these German warriors came to Chile, they encountered the pure indigenous spirit, and by mixing with them, they created a superior race, the Chilean race. And just to be clear, this is not my theory. I never read it, and I have no interest to read it, to be honest. This is how a Chilean person once told me about it. A lot more interesting things happened in Chile in the 18th and 19th century, and to be honest, I'm really sorry I didn't mention your favorite ones, but I'm trying to mention those that I think that are relevant to the story that I want to say next. So, that being said, let's now pass to the next checkpoint in the Chilean history, the beginning of the 20th century. The first big challenge to Chile in the 20th century came with the end of the First World War, for 2 main reasons. Firstly, the Chilean nitrate was suddenly useless on the world's market. The war was over and the arms race with it. Not only that, but the Europeans haven't even used all the explosives during the First World War. They still had a lot left. And the second factor, invention of synthetic nitrate, which, as you may imagine, was significantly more cheaper than the normal one. These 2 factors almost killed the Chilean economy that has been growing so far. And when the economy is growing, it's very easy to contain social unrest. And also, it's important to mention that despite having a horrible condition, the Chilean workers had a little bit better than the others in the South American workers. And please, don't make a mistake, despite that, the conditions were still horrible. But still, this was the reality, which as you may very well imagine, resulted in a very low workers' activity, like strikes and demonstration. Again, not to say that they were non-existent, but they were not very common. So what happened to this South American country after the product that it mostly exported and the revenue from which constituted more than 60% of the GDP suddenly became useless in the world market? As you may have correctly guessed, if you have 2 brain cells, is that it went to hell, beginning the Chilean first economical crisis. As we all know by this point, who is the first one to suffer under capitalist economical crisis? The working class, of course. This, in turn, resulted in massive strikes and demonstrations. The workers started very seriously fighting for their rights, which was always very hardly repressed by the ruling class. For me personally, this is when the Chilean radical left-wing movement begins. Demonstrations and strikes were everywhere around the country. It even touched the seasonal workers. Yeah, remember those guys? Those guys still existed, because despite the rapid industrialization of the country, no land reforms were ever made. So those guys also woke up and joined the fight. They were demanding land reforms and political rights. Because despite Chile being a republic, the agricultural worker had no political power. They were forced to vote for the same person as the owner of the land vote. So in the end, they combined with the workers and created mass movement that shook all the Chilean society. Being the end of this mass movement, what is now known in Chilean history as the White Terror. The White Terror in the 1920s was a period of political and social repression, marked by state-sanctioned violence and human rights abuse. It targeted leftist and labor activists, and it was part of a broader global context of anti-communist sentiment and crackdowns on leftist movements. It has lasting impact on Chilean society and politics. It contributed to radicalization of some leftist movements and laid groundwork for political division that will persist to years to come. Still, despite all the massive terror and repression, the government was forced to a wall. It was forced to start to pay attention to the social part of society. With a lot of resistance in the same 20s, they started making small social reforms. The first one to ride this wave was a liberal president called Arturo Alexandri. Alexandri was associated with reformist and progressive political ideas. He was a strong advocate for social and economical reforms, which resonated with many working class and middle class Chileans. His government introduced various social labor programs aimed at improving the well-being of the workers and their families. His initiatives contributed to a broader social safety net. It was under him that 8-hour workday were established, that public healthcare and public pensions were made a bit more accessible. Although, it'd be wise to say that in a very raw form, that functioned very badly for the workers, Also, it was under him that the land reforms were first initiated, reforms that functioned more on the paper than in reality. Despite his reform being very slowly implemented and badly enforced, still, the elites of the country were not very happy with them. Not only them, but also the working class and the peasantry, who were still protesting and fighting for their rights and better conditions. This, in turn, resulted in a coup by the general who goes by the name of Carlos Ibáñez, leader of a military junta, who by the pretext of making war in the country, took power off in Chile. Despite having mainly nationalistic agenda, he continued some of the progression measures started by the predecessor, but much more slower and with a much more easier hand. Before continuing, I would love to talk about the military juntas in Chile, because before Pinochet, military juntas were not necessarily a bad thing in the eyes of the population, which will be an important factor in the things to come. Since its inception, Chile had at least 11 military juntas that took power, usually only for a short period of time, with the purpose of restoring order, which of course means mass suppression of the population. Still, as you will see next, they were not always right-wing or bloody. So when Ibáñez comes to power, he continues some of his predecessors' reforms, all with more nationalistic tendency, while simultaneously, of course, smashing all the workers' movement around the country. A common tactic used by his government was the so-called sand-burying. So basically, the state approved the unions and worker protest, but in the morning of the protest, they came to the indicated place, fill everything with sand, and later, when the protesters are doing the demonstration there, the police comes on horses and beats the crap out of the workers, who because of the sand, have a very limited movement. Also under him, the worker suppression was starting to gain a familiar form. Already in the late 20s, we have records of workers dying in strike. On the other side, we also have several records of Chilean workers getting armed and taking over factories, both things that were inexisting before. Many of his tactics were later implemented and improved under Pinochet's regime. Still, with all of this you might wonder, what about the economical depression that you mentioned earlier? How did it end it? Which is a fair question, and to be honest, I've been avoiding to talk about it till this point. Cause remember those military conquests that I mentioned in the beginning of the video? Remember that I mentioned that they also have copper mines. That started being important now, because what is also happening in the 20s around the world is a mass electrification of everything. What do you use to pass electricity? Copper. Chilean copper, if we are being precise. This, in turn, helped the Chilean economy recover, and also help finance some of those projects that I mentioned before. The thing here is that there's a but in this story. Majority of copper exploration in Chile was done on an American investment. Because don't forget that after the suicide attempt, or as historians call it, the First World War, Europe started losing its grip around the world. And by economical imperialism rules, you always need someone to have the grip on the world by economical means, and not only. So the US took the role of the big brother, for now only in the South America, and very softly. It's also very important to mention that the time when the military junta was in power, That coincides with the time when American investments start flowing like river in Chile. I'm not saying that the US had something to do with this coup, but at least they very heavily benefited from its existence. The American corporation started drilling everywhere around the country, exploiting every piece of land that they possibly could, which created a very weird situation where American companies were exploiting Chilean mines, and in exchange, they gave some money to the Chilean government. For that, they received full liberty to do whatever they want. In reality, those mines function as small US enclaves where no Chilean law applied. To make it even more easier to understand, the US created small colonies inside Chile, where they completely control everything happening there, and later exporting all the production back to the US, while at the same time paying few pennies to the Chilean state. This gave the US corporation and the US government an incredible power and leverage in the Chilean government. Just for you to understand the scale of this, for some time the US bank, which was called National City Bank, created and based in the US, had the exclusive rights to represent the Chilean government in the US Congress. And don't get me wrong, things like this still happen even today, but I don't recall such a naked form of economical colonialism. Once again, just for you to have a picture, everything that in the US was said or done by the National City Bank, a private bank, was considered an official position of the Chilean people. All this subjugation by the USA and the very slow and badly implemented progressive legislation were slowly but steadily radicalizing all strata of society. The workers have been there all this time, fighting, dying. But now, other parts of society were starting to get infected by this red virus. To be fair, it was a common trend around the world. Because before that, what was the main point of view of the conservatives, middle, and upper class about the worker? I could never tell, but I assume it was something like this. There is this mythical creature called the worker, who is chilling under the sun mostly. Sometimes he throws his picker around to mine some copper or to do something in the factory, when he's not taking a siesta, of course. Happy, no reason to stress. And then, one day, some foreign agent goes to his place of work and offers him some strange book by a guy called Marx or something. The worker, because he's bored, he opens and maybe reads it, and then it's over. His eyes become red, and the only thing he wants is to strike and revolt against the government. You might think that I'm overreacting, and I am to a certain point, but still, the conservatives could not understand why the workers were fighting for their rights, for social justice. They never did before that, so why would they do now? So it must have been a virus, or somebody was paying them. Even today, we hear similar things. The upper class generally doesn't understand how this is possible. If you have the possibility, read the conservative texts from the 30s. Although, to be fair, many of them think the same thing these days. Every month, there is a new interview with some CEO saying something like this.
Employment has to jump 40-50% in my view. We need to see pain in the economy. We need to remind people that they work for the employer, not the other way around. I mean, there's been a systematic change where employees feel the employer is extremely lucky to have them, as opposed to the other way around.
Still, nonetheless, the red virus and its ideas were starting to spread outside of the workers' movement, to the rest of the Chilean society. The logical conclusion of the rising tensions in society and very slow progress accompanied by a very high level of inequality is very predictable. All there was needed was a catalysator. Things drastically changed for Chile with the coming of the Great Depression in the 30s, for two main reasons. First was the fact that its economy was fully controlled by US investment, which suddenly stopped due to a massive financial crisis. And the second one being the fact that the US was the main market where Chile sold its goods. Both of those things stopped being a viable possibility during the Great Depression, which in terms resulted in Chile being one of the most affected countries during the Great Depression. Combined with what I described before, this situation could not result in anything else than a revolution, a very specific revolution, one made by the Chilean army, a military junta. On June 4th, 1932, A group of military officers, led by Marmaduke Gov and Eugenio Mate, staged a coup against the government. The coup led to the establishment of the Socialist Republic of Chile. Marmaduke Gov, a retired general, assumed the position of provisional president. This is an important point for me. Despite in the end the government only lasting 2 weeks, it was the first official Chilean socialist government, a fact that many forget to mention when talking about Allende's government, because in Chile's socialist government, with the socialist ideas, was not only a theoretical possibility, but a fact in Chilean history and people's mind. Despite only lasting 2 weeks, its intentions were extremely progressive, giving a lot of power to the workers, peasants, and indigenous people. There were created Soviets across all country that made political demand, being the majority related with a remaking of the government as the government of the workers and peasants, expropriation of land and mines from the Americans, etc. All this had an enormous impact because from this point on, the proletarians started demanding not only improvement of their lives and work condition, but also political demand. They became an important part of the Chilean political game. Unfortunately, the Socialist Republic of Chile was destroyed by a counter-revolution, organized by the reactionary part of the army in the same year. But its presence didn't go unnoticed in Chile's political life. So after the fall of the Socialist Republic of Chile, the governments that came after to power were heavily influenced by it. Mass campaign of infrastructure and industrialization began in Chile. And it's important to mention again that till that time, Chile was a country whose economy was fully oriented to export, while importing the majority of essential things that it needed, including food, because despite having vast chunks of fertile land, the majority of them were still in the hands of old feudal rulers, operating a feudal way, which as you might imagine, was far from being the most optimal way in the 20th century. Resolving these two main problems and turning Chile into a more progressive country, a 20th century country, was the main route of the Chilean government in the 30s of the last century. Despite being liberal governments in its majority, it's important to mention that the communists were very present in Chile's political life after the fall of the Socialist Republic. Despite never occupying leading roles, there were several instances where certain open communists were appointed to specific ministers' cabinets. All this accompanied by even a harder rise in Chile's left-wing movement, being the culmination of all of this, the election in 1938, when a far-left coalition managed to get one of them as the president of Chilean Republic. I'm talking about Pedro Aguirre Cerda. The main focus of this coalition was the social problem of Chile. While they were in power, mandatory schooling was enforced, forced increase in salaries across all industries, construction of housing and hospitals for the working class, etc. During the time that the left-wing coalition was in power, Chile became one of the most progressive countries in South America in regards of social justice, despite all of its natural resources were still in the hands of US companies. This period is important for us for another reason, mainly because it was under this government that Salvador Allende began his political career. At the time, he occupied the post of health minister. As you may imagine, everything was going too well for Chile, and we couldn't go like that without consequence. So the consequence came in 1945, after the end of the Second World War, when the communist idea were at its peak around the world. When the communists were seen as the saviors, the one who defeated Nazi, and Chile was no exception. In Chile, where they already were very popular, they now became the dominant idea in society. But with so much American interest in Chile, the US was forced to intervene. To combat the massive red wave that was happening in Chile and all across South America, The United States in 1947 created the OAS, Organization of American States. The official doctrine of this organization, and I mean official and public, which was stated in its founding mission, was to combat communism. Chile was a part of this organization, which mainly functioned in the following way. We, the USA, give your country as much money as you want, but in exchange, you commit to fight any manifestation of communism or left-wing ideas in your country, and let us build military bases in your territory. In the height of the Cold War, Chile had to choose a side, and unfortunately, they chose the US side. In reality, we all understand that there was no real choice there. You either submit or you suffer the USA wrath. Also, around the same period, School of Americas was founded, which I will go in more details when talking about Pinochet and his team, but very briefly, while giving millions, the US also created 30 plus military bases in South America alone. During that period, these bases that were also used to educate officers from all across South America, educate them not only in the art of war, but also in anti-left-wing action. Yes, it was mainly an ideological washing school. Many of its graduates later become the main protagonists of state terror in all South America, massacring hundreds and thousands of their own countrymen. We start seeing manifestation of this deal almost immediately in Chilean society and politics. Despite red ideas being extremely popular in Chilean society, in 1947, all open communists were fired from their political offices, while simultaneously all ties with the USSR were cut. And it didn't stop there, far from it. In 1948, the Law of Defense of Democracy was passed, where open communist sympathizers are destituted from any legal rights and any possibility of serving in public offices. The Communist Party is prohibited, and its more popular leaders and the most public labor activists were thrown in concentration camp known as Pisagua in northern Chile. This is also a very important term, because when Pinochet will come to power later on, he will not be an innovator in social repression terms. He will be using the bases already created before him, but of course, just taking them to another level. Although, it will be unfair to say that there was no social progress in Chile at the time. As I mentioned before, in the 40s and 50s, the US was giving money to the South American countries that were openly suppressing the internal communists. Millions and millions were given to those countries, the majority of which went to the pockets of the upper class, but some of them were used in order to build and improve social infrastructure. During this period, we see an increase in general earnings all across the country, a very small increase in the lower class, a medium increase in the medium class, and an enormous increase in the upper class, which despite the few social programs that were enacted, created an even bigger social disequality. In the beginning of the 50s, Chile was continuing anti-left-wing politics, although with less intensity. This decrease in intensity mainly due to the growing pressure from the street. Despite beheading the left-wing movement at the time, still, the repression didn't achieve the Pinochet level, and mainly because it was a grassroots movement. As long as the material condition of oppression persisted, new faces would always arise. From the same pressure, for example, in 1958 the Anti-Communist Act was dismissed. On an economical level, Chile continued to increase its economical disparity, although it increased its infrastructure significantly, with the money given to them by the US for the communist heads. It was a certain stability. We can even say a stability very favorable to the Chilean and the American economical elite. But then everything changed in 1959. As some of you commies may suspect, of course I'm talking about the Cuban Revolution. In 1959, when half of the world was red and there was no prospect of anything changing soon, when both blocs heavily established their dominance in their respective parts of the world, out of nowhere, the Cuban Revolution happened. And it's important to mention that Cuba was one of the most important countries in Latin America at the time, and Havana was considered one of the most developed cities in South America. I guess you can imagine how that shocked the rest of the Latin America. The fact that under the USA nose, in one of the most influential Latin American countries, the revolution won served as a mass catalyst for the left-wing movement in all the rest of South America. Once again, giving left-wing ideals a very big impulse in popularity. Revolution was no more a dream, it was real, it was happening just next door. From this new burst of energy, a new force arrived, a compromise between the Chilean political elites, the Christian Democrat. This party was born from a compromise, and compromise was its main doctrine, as we're gonna see later on. From this exact party, another key member of Chilean history arose, President Frei. It is important to talk about Frei and his presidency. Frei was a compromising figure between the streets and the elites. At that point, the Chilean ruling class knew that reforms were needed if they didn't want to end up with a revolution like it had happened in the neighbor Cuba. During Frei's presidency, a very heavy social reforms were made, including the implementation of pensions, reforms, tax reforms, and most importantly, a massive agricultural reforms. Yes, Frei was the first one who tried to dismantle the still semi-feudal agricultural system existing in Chile since the 19th century, where massive clutches of land were owned by a few feudal lords. Despite managing to get only a portion of the total land back from its feudal lords during his presidency, still, it was much more than any of the previous presidents. The expropriated land was given to a sort of cooperative. It was not a cooperative as we imagined them, but still, a very similar concept, thus creating a bunch of new small landowners across the country. It was also during his presidency that Chile remembered that they had enormous copper mines that belonged to American companies. And so, during his presidency, the process of nationalization of Chilean mines began. At the time, Chile government agreed to buy 51% of the shares at a very good price for the American companies, thus letting the American companies around 49% of the shares in the mine. In any case, despite very needed and useful reforms, they were very badly implemented, and mostly slow. It was not the first time that the progressive reforms were implemented in a very slow manner and sabotaged by the economical elites. Still, this reform began a process that could not be set back. The elite could not rule as they used to, and the masses didn't want to live as they used to. As we approach the 70s, the anti-American sentiment that started in the mid-50s was at its peak. And this is very important to remember for what's going to happen next. But why? To start, we have the constant economical blockade of Cuba that culminated in the Big Bay invasion, which basically was the USA invading another country to depose its government. And I know that for us living now, that's a very normal thing, but at the time, USA invading and deposing foreign country was not normal at all. Not only that, but they failed in the invasion, which was interpreted by the public as lack of strength from the part of USA. Besides that, there was the Vietnam War going on, with the world being shocked at the constant USA atrocities in the imperialist war. Protests were happening all across the globe. Simultaneously, cultural revolutions were happening all over the West. Being the most popular one in the public conscience, the events of May 68 in France. But it was by far the only one. From Mexico City to Berlin, the strikes and student protests were more powerful than ever. The idea of the world revolution and the end of capitalism was on every corner of the globe. As you may imagine, it was not a very good time for the American values, and a very good time for left-wing ideas. For this small period of time, the West was turning left, anti-capitalism and anti-Americanism was at its peak. Of course, the discontent with the implementation of the reforms and the massive anti-capitalist sentiment culminated in Chile in a movement known as Unidad Popular, which was a coalition between the Communist Party, Socialist Party, and even some members of Christian Party. Although, it's important to mention that in Chile, the names were a bit inverse. The Communist Party of Chile was the most peaceful one, the one that defended winning by election. I would say a typical Euro-communist party, while the Socialist Party were the radicals, those who defended that revolution was needed. The future president Allende was a member of a socialist party. As you might have guessed by now, all the preconditions were set for the left-wing victory in the 1970s elections. Being the strongest factor in my opinion, the large coalition created by all the left-wing sides, in form of Unidad Popular, which guaranteed them a very big support from the population. At this point it's a meme, but we all know it, that the revolution will happen the day after that the left will stop its infighting. So, what was this so-called Unidad Popular? Basically, it was constituted by 6 elements: the Socialist Party, the Communist Party, the Radical Party, the Social Democrat Party, the Independent Popular Action, and MAPU. But the core and the majority of this ideologically diverse group was for sure the Communist and the Socialist Party. Only these 2 elements by themselves had the support of more than 1/3 of total Chilean voters. As a compromise figure between all of these different left-wing political parties, the figure of Salvador Allende arose. He was by far the only candidate, and the debates inside the coalition were long and intense, but in the end, he was chosen as the face of this new coalition that was supposed to bring Chile into a new era. This massive coalition managed to get significant support from the population. The eyes of the world started gathering on Chile. Unfortunately, as we now know, the USSR didn't give significant support towards the Unidad Popular. The Soviet Union didn't have faith in an election in a bourgeoisie country. Besides that, they considered that even if they won, all the bourgeoisie mechanism would make it impossible for a Marxist government to achieve anything significant in a capitalist country. Unfortunately, they turned out to be right, at least to some degree. On the other hand, the Big Brother could not just stand by and watch. To give even more context, it was time of Nixon and Kissinger. As we now know, the USA took the Marxist threat very seriously. They immediately elaborated 2 plans of action. First one, consisting in pumping as much money as possible into the opposition. The second one, consisting in staging a military coup in case of left-wing victory, that would establish a right-wing military dictatorship. Both of those plans were developed in parallel. In practical level, that means that a massive propaganda campaign began in Chile media against the left-wing coalition, while on the other hand, CIA was recruiting members of the military. The second plan ended up being a massive failure that ended up being very beneficial to the left-wing coalition. I'm talking about the incident with the infamous general René Schneider. So what's this crazy story that deserves its own movie? The plan was very simple. A group of officers, recruited and directed by the CIA, decided to take hostage one of Chile's most famous generals and put the blame on the left wing. But as always, nothing goes as planned. While trying to take him hostage, the general started resisting heavily, creating a massive shootout, in a result of which the general was killed. We now know that this action was directed by the CIA. At the time, nobody knew, and all the action was presented as an independent move from the Chilean right-wing forces, which in turn resulted in an increase of support for the Chilean left wing. A late investigation ended up showing that a lot of people were involved in this failed coup, from generals to parliamentarians, but in the end, only one general was judged as a result and exiled from the country for 5 years. The rest remained untouched. Later on, this will play a bad joke as many of them were directly responsible or involved in the coup that happened in 1973. These events increased the already big support for the existing left-wing movement in Chile and created an even bigger polarization of Chilean society. The head of this movement, after big discussion and big infighting, ended up being the aforementioned Salvador Allende. The coalition program was simple: bring upon the revolution by peaceful means, by winning parliamentary election, a long-lasting dream of all European communists, which in terms of legal and legislative measure consisted in slowly implementing gradual change in society that will put them on the path to communism, a fact that later on will pay against the Chilean left. In 1970's election, Allende's opponents were Rodomica Tomic, who was a center-left candidate, what we now would call a spoiler candidate, which main function was to get away voters from the left-wing coalition. For that purpose, they had an aesthetically very left-wing program and other feature. And last but not least, the third candidate was Jorge Alexandri, a right-wing candidate with a typical neoliberal program, with many things from his program later will be implemented by Pinochet and his regime. As a result, when the time came and the Chilean people went to polls, the result was something like this: around 36% for Allende, 34% for Alexandri, and 27% for Tomic. Still, I would like to stress that many people forget that we are talking about a bourgeoisie-style democracy, which means that a significant part of the population didn't vote, and those results are a result of active voters. I will let you take your own conclusion out of this. So, despite only having 36% of the vote, Allende was elected president, with the support of the Centrist Party. They negotiated a deal where they recognized the Allende victory. In exchange, all the constitutional rights are guaranteed and protected, and an official recognition from the left-wing coalition of the Chilean military as the only official military force of the Chilean government, which in terms translates in cutting ties with any communist or workers' militia that already existed in the country. Without this deal, Allende would have never become president. So, on November 3rd, the dream of all European communists came true, and open Marxist became the first elected president in a bourgeoisie democracy. I will not talk a lot about Allende. Too many of my comrades already did. I don't want to repeat myself. Although, I will mention a few points that I rarely see mentioned and direct you to a video by PlasticPills that you see now on your screen. I'll also leave the link in the description. A few points that is important to mention is the constant obstacles imposed by the bourgeoisie democracy. Many legislation were blocked or not allowed to pass by several institutions that made the job of transforming the country very hard. Another point is that almost and complete immediate monetary isolation imposed on Chile by the USA, while simultaneously, and I know this may sound strange to you, many of Chilean resources and production were directly or indirectly controlled by the American companies, which made the job of sabotaging them easy. Not only that, but also things like the media were also in very tight ties with the American interest, which played a very important role against the government and were fundamental in the massive sabotage campaign. One other point that I think many forget to mention is the fact that there was not much support from the part of the USSR. At the time, half of the world was drinking from the Soviet cow, which combined with the fact that the Soviet bureaucrats didn't have faith in Chilean project, which resulted in a very low support towards Chilean government. And we now come to the end of my video. And I would love to conclude this video with the traditional Allende last speech, because he was indeed one of the best among us, and his life and work continues to inspire millions around the world, including myself. His death left an enormous scar and trauma across all left-wing movement. If you like this video, consider the Patreon below, and see you soon, I hope, on my video about the counter-revolution in Chile, Pinochet regime. Or maybe something shorter or more abstract. We'll see about that.
La última oportunidad en que me pueda dirigir a ustedes. La Fuerza Aérea ha bombardeado las torres de Radio Portales y Radio Corporación. Mis palabras no tienen amargura sino decepción, y serán ellas el castigo moral para los que han traicionado el juramento que hicieron. Soldados de Chile, comandantes en jefe, titulares, y el almirante Merino que se ha autodesignado, más el señor Mendoza, general rastrero, que solo ayer manifestara su fidelidad y lealtad al gobierno, también será nominado director general del Carabineros. Ante estos hechos, solo me cabe decirle a los trabajadores, yo no voy a renunciar. Colocado en un tránsito histórico, pagaré con mi vida la lealtad del pueblo. Y les digo que tengo la certeza que la semilla que entregáramos a la conciencia digna de miles y miles de chilenos no podrá ser cegada definitivamente. Tienen la fuerza, podrán avasallarnos, pero no se detienen los procesos sociales ni con el crimen ni con la fuerza. La historia es nuestra y la hacen los pueblos. Trabajadores de mi patria, quiero agradecerles la lealtad que siempre tuvieron, la confianza que depositaron en un hombre que solo fue intérprete de grandes anhelos de justicia, que empeñó su palabra y que respetaría la Constitución y la ley, y así lo hizo. En este momento definitivo, el último en que yo pueda dirigirme a ustedes, pero que aprovechen la lección. El capital foráneo, el imperialismo, unido a la reacción, creó el clima para que las Fuerzas Armadas rompieran su tradición, la que le enseñara Schneider y que regimara el comandante Araya. Víctimas del mismo sector social que hoy estará en sus casas esperando con mano ajena reconquistar el poder para seguir defendiendo sus granjerías y sus privilegios. Me dirijo sobre todo a la modesta mujer de nuestra tierra, a la campesina que creyó en nosotros, a la obrera que trabajó más, a la madre que supo nuestra preocupación por los niños. Me dirijo a los profesionales de la patria, a los profesionales patriotas, a los que hace días estuvieron trabajando contra la sedición auspiciada por los colegios profesionales, colegios de clase, para defender también las ventajas que una sociedad capitalista le da a los pocos. Me dirijo a la juventud, a aquellos que cantaron, entregaron su alegría y su espíritu de lucha. Me dirijo al hombre de Chile, al obrero, al campesino, al intelectual, aquellos que serán perseguidos, porque en nuestro país el fascismo ya estuvo hace muchas horas presente en los atentados terroristas, volando los puentes, llegando a la línea férrea, destruyendo los oleoductos y los gasoductos, frente al silencio de los que tenían la obligación de proteger. Estaban comprometidos. La historia lo juzgará. Seguramente Radio Magallanes será callada y el mital tranquilo de mi voz no llegará a ustedes, no importa. Lo seguirán oyendo. Siempre estaré junto a ustedes. Por lo menos mi recuerdo será el hombre digno que fue leal a la ley. El pueblo debe defender, pero no sacrificar. El pueblo no debe dejarse arrasar ni acribillar, pero tampoco puede humillar. Trabajadores de mi patria, tengo fe en Chile y su destino. Superará otros hombres este momento gris y amargo donde la traición pretende imponer. Sigan ustedes sabiendo que mucho más temprano que tarde, de nuevo, abrirán las grandes alamedas por donde pase el hombre libre para construir una sociedad mejor. ¡Viva Chile! ¡Viva el pueblo! ¡Vivan los trabajadores! Estas fueron mis últimas palabras. Tengo la certeza de que mi sacrificio no será en vano. Tengo la certeza de que por lo menos será una lección moral que castigará la felonía, la cobardía y la traición.